Think about this for a second. The wealthiest, most industrialized nation on earth, a country that had already built transcontinental railroads and skyscrapers and factories that stretched for miles, a country that would soon dominate the entire 20th century, had no national retirement system of any kind until 1935. For more than 150 years, from the founding of the Republic all the way to the middle of the Great Depression, there was no Social Security, no monthly check waiting for you when your working days were over, no safety net, no plan. If you were an ordinary American and you managed to survive into old age, and many people didn't, there was no government waiting to catch you when your body finally gave out. So here's the question almost nobody stops to ask. What actually happened to you when you got old? We tend to imagine that retirement has always existed, that there was always some version of the world we know now, where you work for a few decades and then you stop and you collect your benefits and you get to rest. But that world is astonishingly recent. It's younger than the automobile. It's younger than powered flight. For the overwhelming majority of American history, the concept of a peaceful, financially secure old age simply did not exist for regular people. And the reality of what did exist, the reality of growing old in America before 1935, is grimmer, stranger, and far more revealing than the sanitized version most of us were handed in school. Because the story of how America finally built a safety net for its elderly is not a story of gentle, inevitable progress. It's a story of poorhouses and desperation, of families crushed under the weight of caring for parents they couldn't afford to feed, of a mass political movement led by a retired doctor that terrified the establishment, and of a set of deliberate, calculated compromises, some of them noble, some of them shameful, that shaped the system tens of millions of Americans still depend on to this day. So let me take you back to that world. The world before the check. The world where getting old was one of the most dangerous things that could happen to you. Let's start with the single most important thing to understand about old age in early America, the thing that shapes everything else. For most people, there was no such thing as retirement, because the entire idea of stopping work was a luxury that almost nobody could afford. You worked until you physically could not work anymore. That was the plan. That was the whole plan. The numbers here are genuinely striking. In 1880, roughly 80% of American men over the age of 65 were still in the labor force. 80%. These were not men easing into their golden years. These were men in their late 60s, their 70s, sometimes their 80s, still swinging hammers, still walking behind plows, still standing at workbenches, because the day they stopped earning was the day the money stopped coming in. And for many of them, especially the millions who worked on farms, there was no clean line between working and not working at all. A farmer didn't retire. He just did a little less each year as his strength faded, leaned a little harder on his sons until one day he couldn't get out of bed, and then he was dependent. And then often he was a burden. Your body was your pension. That was the brutal arithmetic of it. As long as your body could produce, you ate and you had a roof. When your body broke down, you had whatever you had managed to save, which for a working person in the 19th century was usually very little, and whatever your family could spare, and beyond that, nothing but charity and dread. So what happened when the body finally failed? When a man could no longer earn, or a widow was left with nothing after her husband died? In that world, before any government program existed, you essentially had three options, and each one tells you something dark about the era. The first option, and by far the most common, was family. In pre-industrial America, the elderly were absorbed back into the households of their children. 3 generations under one roof was not a Norman Rockwell fantasy. It was an economic survival strategy. Grandparents lived with their adult children, helped raise the grandchildren, contributed what labor they still could, and in exchange were fed and sheltered until they died. Many states even had what were called filial responsibility laws, statutes that legally required adult children to support their aging parents. The family was the safety net. The family was Social Security. But here's the problem, and it's a problem that industrialization made worse and worse as the decades passed. That whole system depended on a stable, rooted agricultural society where children stayed near their parents and there was always room for one more at the table and one more pair of hands in the field. And America in the late 19th and early 20th century was tearing that world apart. Young people were leaving the farms and pouring into the cities. They were cramming into tiny apartments where there was no room for an aging parent. They were chasing wages in factories hundreds of miles from home. The economy was becoming mobile, urban, and impersonal. And the old bargain that children would care for their parents was quietly breaking down. An aging couple on a failing farm might have 5 children, and every single one of them might be in a distant city, barely surviving themselves, unable to send a dime home. The family safety net was fraying exactly when people needed it most. The second option was charity. Churches, benevolent societies, ethnic and immigrant aid organizations, fraternal lodges. If you were lucky enough to belong to a community that took care of its own, you might get help. But this was patchy, unreliable, and deeply humiliating. And it depended entirely on who you were and where you lived and whether the local charity happened to have any money left that month. Charity was a lottery, and old age was not the kind of thing you wanted to gamble on. And then there was the third option, the one that haunted the working people of America like a nightmare, the one that parents whispered about and used to frighten themselves into saving every spare penny, the poorhouse. If you have never heard the phrase "over the hill to the poorhouse," understand that for generations of Americans, it was one of the most terrifying phrases in the language. There was even a hugely popular poem and later a silent film built around exactly that image, the elderly parent cast out and abandoned, making the long walk to the poorhouse to die among strangers. The poorhouse, also called the almshouse or the poor farm, was the institution of absolute last resort. The place you ended up when you had no family, no savings, no charity, and no ability to work. It was where society swept the people it had no other use for. The old, the sick, the disabled, the insane, the orphaned, all thrown together in one grim, underfunded, county-run building. And these were not gentle places. Relief in the poorhouse was made deliberately unpleasant, and I mean that literally. The prevailing philosophy of the time held that if help was too comfortable, people would choose to be poor, so conditions were kept degrading on purpose, to discourage anyone from relying on them. In many places, entering the poorhouse meant you actually lost your rights. You could lose the right to vote. You could lose the right to own property. In some jurisdictions, you weren't even allowed to leave freely or to marry. There are records of the poor being required to wear a large letter P on their clothing, to publicly mark them as paupers, as objects of shame. One reformer of the era described the very word poorhouse as a word of hate and loathing, a place that combined every horror of poverty, disgrace, loneliness, and abandonment into a single institution. Think about what that meant psychologically for an ordinary working person. You could spend your entire life laboring honestly, raising a family, breaking your body for decades, and if you were unlucky, if you got sick, if your savings evaporated, if your children couldn't take you in, you could end your days as a marked pauper in a county poorhouse, stripped of your dignity and your rights, waiting to die. That was not some rare, distant fate. That was a real and present danger for a huge share of the population, and the numbers bear it out. When the Great Depression hit, the population of these almshouses surged, rising by nearly 75% in just a few years in some surveyed areas, as the elderly poor had nowhere else to go. The poorhouse wasn't a relic. It was a functioning and expanding part of American life well into the 20th century. Now you might be thinking, surely there was something, surely a country this rich had built some kind of pension system, some protection for its workers. And the answer is yes, there were fragments, a patchwork of small, incomplete, wildly uneven programs. But when you look closely at each one, you see just how thin and full of holes that patchwork really was. The first and most surprising piece of the puzzle was military pensions, and specifically the pensions paid to Union veterans of the Civil War. This is one of the great forgotten facts of American history. Decades before Social Security, the United States government ran what was, in effect, a massive old age and disability pension system, and it did it almost by accident. After the Civil War, and especially after a sweeping pension law passed in 1890, the government began paying pensions to Union veterans, eventually to essentially any Union veteran who was old or disabled, regardless of whether their condition had anything to do with the war. By 1900, roughly 1 in 5 white men over the age of 55 in the entire country was collecting a Union Army pension, and these payments became so enormous that by the 1890s, Civil War pensions were swallowing up close to a third of the entire federal budget. Let that sink in. America's first great experiment in social insurance for the elderly was hiding inside its veterans program, and it was one of the largest expenditures the government made. But look at who it left out. It was only for Union veterans, which meant it did essentially nothing for the entire South. It did little for women except widows. It did nothing for the tens of millions of ordinary workers who had never worn a blue uniform. It was a pension system for one specific, shrinking group of men, and as that generation died off, so did the program. It proved that the government could run a mass pension system. It just refused for decades to extend that idea to everyone else. The second piece of the patchwork was private pensions offered by employers. And this is where the modern idea of the company pension was actually born. In 1875, the American Express Company created what's generally considered the first formal private pension plan in the United States. A few years later, in 1884, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad introduced its own. The big railroads, then the largest employers in the country, led the way, followed by some banks and steel and oil companies. On paper, this sounds like real progress, but the reality was far less generous. These early pensions covered a tiny sliver of the workforce, often well under 1% to begin with. The rules were brutally strict. You typically had to work for the same company for 30 years to qualify, and here's the catch that made them almost worthless as security. They were usually funded entirely by the employer with no legal protection for the worker, which meant the company could change the rules, cut the benefit, or cancel the whole thing whenever it wanted. If you were fired at year 29, you got nothing. If the company went bankrupt, and thousands did during the Depression, your pension vanished into thin air along with the company. A private pension in this era wasn't a guarantee. It was a promise, and a promise is only as good as the people making it. When the economy collapsed, an enormous number of those promises simply evaporated. There were other fragments too. Workers banded together in fraternal organizations and mutual aid societies, pooling small dues so that when a member fell ill or died, there'd be a little money for the family. Some labor unions ran their own benefit funds. These were genuinely important, and for many working class and immigrant families, they were the difference between coping and catastrophe. But they were small, local, and financially fragile. A single bad year, a wave of unemployment, a run of deaths, and the fund could be wiped out. And finally, in the years just before Social Security, a handful of states began experimenting with their own old age pension laws. The first ones that actually functioned appeared only in 1923 in Montana and Nevada. Over the next decade, the idea spread, and by 1935, 30 states had some kind of old age pension law on the books. That sounds like a lot until you look at how they actually worked. Many were optional at the county level, so counties simply chose not to fund them. The benefits were tiny and the eligibility rules were harsh, and the result was almost farcically inadequate. On the eve of Social Security, only about 3% of America's elderly were actually receiving any state pension at all, and the average benefit came to roughly 65 cents a day. 65 cents. That was the sum total of the American welfare state for the elderly. A few pennies a day for a tiny fraction of the people who needed it. So step back and take in the full picture. This was the richest country on earth, and its plan for old age amounted to this: work until you drop. Hope your family can take you in. Pray you don't end up in the poorhouse. And if you were extraordinarily lucky, maybe there'd be a small pension, a fragile one, that could disappear at any moment. That was it. That was the system. Which raises an obvious question. Why? Why was America so far behind? Because it's not as though no one on earth had figured this out. Across the Atlantic, other nations were decades ahead. Germany, under Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, had created the world's first national old age social insurance program all the way back in 1889. Bismarck, no socialist, did it precisely to take the wind out of the socialists' sails to bind workers to the state. Britain followed with old age pensions in 1908 and a broader national insurance system in 1911. By the time America finally acted in 1935, much of the industrialized world had already been running old age pension systems for a generation or more. The United States wasn't a pioneer, it was a laggard. The reasons run deep into the American character and the American system of government. There was a powerful, almost religious belief in self-reliance. The idea that a man should provide for himself and that needing help was a personal and moral failing rather than a structural problem. There was a deep suspicion of anything that smelled like a government handout, or the dole, as it was scornfully called. There was the poorhouse mentality itself, the conviction that the poor were poor because of their own vice or laziness, and that making their lives easier would only encourage more of it. There was the fractured nature of American federalism, which left most questions of welfare to the states and localities, ensuring a chaotic patchwork instead of a national solution. And there was the rise of what's sometimes called welfare capitalism, the belief, pushed by big employers, that companies, not the government, should provide for their workers. A belief that conveniently kept power in the hands of the employers. For all of these reasons, America clung to its brutal, improvised, every family for itself approach to old age far longer than almost any comparable nation. And it took a catastrophe of unimaginable scale to finally break that resistance. It took the Great Depression. When the Depression hit after the crash of 1929, it didn't just cause a recession, it systematically demolished every single one of those fragile supports that the elderly had been leaning on. Bank failures wiped out the life savings of millions of people overnight, including the elderly who had done everything right and saved for decades. The private pensions that workers had been counting on collapsed as companies went under. The state pension funds and charities ran dry as demand exploded and revenue vanished. And the family safety net, the oldest support of all, buckled completely because now the children were unemployed too. How do you take in your aging parents when you can't feed your own kids, when a quarter of the workforce is out of a job? The Depression didn't just make old people poor. It made everyone poor at the same time, which meant the old informal system of families and charity absorbing the elderly had nothing left to absorb them with. The statistics from those years are staggering. By 1935, the best estimates were that more than half of America's elderly could not support themselves. Old age dependency, which had been climbing for decades, shot up to around 50%, and by 1940, it would reach 2/3. 2 out of every 3 older Americans unable to make it on their own. The committee that studied the problem for President Roosevelt reported that between 1/3 and 1/2 of the roughly 7.5 million Americans over 65 were dependent on their families or on public charity to survive. This was not a fringe problem affecting a few unlucky people. This was a systemic collapse of security for an entire generation of older Americans, and it was happening in plain sight in every city and town in the country, And out of that desperation came one of the most extraordinary and least remembered political movements in American history. It started, of all places, in Long Beach, California, with a retired physician named Dr. Francis Townsend. According to the story he told, Townsend looked out his window one morning and saw several elderly women, ragged and starving, digging through garbage cans looking for scraps of food. And something in him snapped. He sat down and wrote a letter to his local newspaper in the autumn of 1933, laying out a bold, simple, radical plan. Townsend proposed that the federal government pay $200 a month to every American over the age of 60. $200, which was an enormous sum at the time, more than most working families earned. There were just two conditions. You had to stop working, which would open up jobs for younger people, and you had to spend the entire $200 within the month, which Townsend believed would flood money into the economy and end the Depression. It was part pension plan, part economic stimulus, part utopian dream. And it caught fire like almost nothing before it. Townsend clubs sprang up across the country, and within a couple of years, the movement claimed millions of supporters, with hundreds of thousands of dues-paying members at its core. Older Americans who had felt invisible and discarded suddenly had a cause and a voice and a movement of their own. In some parts of the country, the Townsend Plan became the single biggest political issue there was, and candidates who supported it were swept into Congress. The pressure on Washington became intense and impossible to ignore. Now the economists who looked at Townsend's plan tore it to pieces. They calculated that paying that much money to that many people would have cost something like 1.5 times the entire budget of all federal, state, and local governments combined. It would have required massive tax increases and, by some estimates, could have slashed the real incomes of ordinary workers. As a piece of economic policy, it was frankly unworkable. But that misses the point entirely. The Townsend movement wasn't important because it was a good plan. It was important because it revealed a bottomless nationwide hunger for exactly the kind of security America had refused to provide for a century and a half. And it wasn't alone. On the political left, Senator Huey Long of Louisiana was rallying millions with his Share Our Wealth program. Upton Sinclair nearly won the governorship of California on a plan to end poverty. The pressure was building from every direction, and it was building fast. Franklin Roosevelt understood exactly what was happening. He could see that if the government didn't offer a sober, workable version of old age security, the public might well embrace something far more radical. And so, partly out of genuine conviction and partly to channel and contain that explosive energy, his administration got to work. In 1934, Roosevelt created a body called the Committee on Economic Security, and he put it under the direction of his Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. And Perkins deserves to be far more famous than she is. She was the first woman ever to hold a position in a presidential cabinet, a formidable, brilliant reformer who had spent her whole career fighting for workers and the poor. She had actually witnessed the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire years earlier, and it had marked her for life. Roosevelt handed her the job of designing a system that could protect Americans against the great hazards of modern life and, crucially, a system that would last, that could survive the courts, survive future politicians, and become permanent. The plan that Perkins and her committee produced and that Congress debated and reshaped through 1935 was built on a clever two-part structure, and understanding that structure is the key to understanding Social Security itself. One part was for the people who were already old and already destitute, the people who couldn't wait. That was old age assistance. Straightforward, means-tested grants sent to the states to help them support their elderly poor right now. The other part was the truly revolutionary piece, and it was aimed at the future. That was old age insurance, the program we now simply call Social Security. Under it, workers would pay a small tax out. Of every paycheck during their working lives, their employers would match it, and in exchange, when they reached old age, they would receive a monthly benefit as a right that they had earned for the rest of their lives. On August 14, 1935, Franklin Roosevelt sat at his desk, surrounded by members of Congress and cabinet officials, with Frances Perkins standing just behind him, and he signed the Social Security Act into law. For the first time in the nation's history, the federal government had accepted direct, permanent responsibility for the economic security of its older citizens. A century and a half of the poorhouse and the pauper's pee and the long walk over the hill was, at least in principle, coming to an end. But I want to be honest with you about this law, because the popular story tends to wrap it in a golden glow, and the truth is more complicated and more interesting in both directions. First, the brilliant part. That decision to fund it through a payroll tax, to make workers pay in so they'd feel they had earned their benefit, was not an accident, and it wasn't just about the money. It was a deliberate political masterstroke. Roosevelt understood that if Social Security were simply a government handout, a future Congress could kill it whenever the political wind shifted. But if workers had paid into it their whole lives, if they saw it as their money and their earned right, then it would become politically untouchable. He said as much in a famous remark that with those tax contributions in there, no politician could ever scrap his Social Security program. And he was right. Nearly a century later, Social Security remains the single most durable and popular government program in American history, the untouchable third rail of American politics, precisely because of that design choice made in 1935. But now, the shameful part, the part that got left out of the textbooks for a very long time. When the Social Security Act passed, it did not cover everyone. Two enormous categories of workers were deliberately excluded from old age insurance. Agricultural laborers, the people who worked the fields, and domestic workers, the maids, cooks, and housekeepers who worked in other people's homes. Together, these exclusions carved out roughly half of the entire American workforce. And it was no coincidence who filled those jobs. In the 1930s, the great majority of Black Americans worked precisely in agriculture and domestic service. The result was that around 65% of all Black workers in the country, and as many as 70 to 80% in parts of the South, were shut out of Social Security from the very beginning. Why? The historical evidence points heavily at the power of Southern Democrats in Roosevelt's coalition. To pass any part of the New Deal, Roosevelt needed the votes of Southern congressmen who controlled key committees, and those men were determined to protect the South's racial order and its supply of cheap Black labor. They feared that federal benefits flowing directly to Black workers would loosen the grip of the plantation and the segregated economy. Excluding farm and domestic workers was a way to keep Black Americans out of the system without ever having to write the word race into the law. It was, in the language scholars later used, a racially coded exclusion hiding behind a category. And people saw it at the time. The NAACP, through the great lawyer Charles Hamilton Houston, the man who would help architect the legal strategy that led to Brown versus Board of Education, testified before Congress and warned that the bill would abandon the Black workers at the very bottom of the economic ladder. The NAACP's magazine ran a bitter editorial calling the plan, in so many words, Social Security for white folk. They lost that fight. The exclusion stayed in. So the safety net that America finally built in 1935 was real, and it was historic, and it genuinely transformed the country. But it was also a net with a hole in it. And that hole was shaped like race and gender and poverty, leaving out many of the very people who needed it most. It would take decades of later reform in the 1950s and beyond to gradually expand coverage and close those gaps. The history of Social Security is, in a sense, the history of America slowly, unevenly, and often reluctantly deciding who counts as a full member of the community deserving of protection. There's one more small detail I have to tell you, because it puts a human face on this entire vast story. When the law first passed, monthly benefits weren't scheduled to begin until 1942. But amendments in 1939 moved that date up, and so, on January 31st, 1940, the very first monthly Social Security retirement check in American history was mailed out. It went to a woman named Ida Mae Fuller, a retired legal secretary and former school teacher from Ludlow, Vermont. During her few years paying into the new system, she had contributed a grand total of about $24.75. Her first check was for $22.54. And here's the beautiful part. Ida Mae Fuller lived to be 100 years old. She collected Social Security for 35 years. And over those decades, she received tens of thousands of dollars in benefits, all built on that first tiny contribution. She became the living symbol of the whole idea, proof that ordinary people would no longer have to face old age alone and afraid. So let's come back to where we started and ask what all of this really means. Because I think the popular understanding of Social Security gets something fundamental wrong. Most of us think of Social Security as boring, as bureaucratic, as a fixed and permanent feature of the landscape like the interstate highways or the postal service, something that has simply always been there and always will be. And that misunderstanding causes us to miss the two most important truths about it. The first truth is that the security we take for granted is stunningly recent, and it was never inevitable. For the vast majority of American history, growing old without money meant the poorhouse. It meant the pauper's mark and the loss of your rights and dying among strangers. The comfortable idea of retirement, the golden years, the notion that a person has earned the right to rest at the end of a working life is not some eternal feature of human existence. It is a 20th century invention built deliberately against fierce resistance out of the wreckage of the Great Depression and the pressure of millions of desperate people. It did not descend from the heavens. It was fought for, and it was won. And it could just as easily never have happened. The second truth is that it was never simple and never purely noble. It was born from a collision of genuine compassion and cold political calculation. It was forced into being by a retired doctor in Long Beach and millions of frightened old people who refused to be ignored. It was designed with real brilliance to be permanent, and it was scarred from its first day by a bargain with Southern segregationists that shut out millions of black and poor and women workers. It is, in other words, exactly like America itself, a genuine and historic act of collective decency, shot through with the compromises and the injustices of its time, and only made fairer through decades of continued struggle. And this is the thing I most want you to take away. When you hear people debate the future of Social Security today, whether it will run out of money, whether it should be cut or changed or privatized, understand that what they are really debating is whether to return, in some form, to the world that existed before 1935. A world where old age and poverty were nearly the same word, where your only pension was your own failing body, where the poorhouse waited at the bottom of the hill for anyone whose luck ran out. That world was not the distant past. Your great-grandparents lived in it. It ended, for most Americans, less than 100 years ago, and it ended only because a generation decided that letting the old die in poverty was no longer acceptable in a nation that could afford to do better. The next time you see that line item on a paycheck or think about that check that will one day come, remember what it actually represents. Not a boring government program, but one of the most consequential decisions this country ever made. The decision that growing old should not mean growing desperate. It's a promise we made to ourselves in the depths of our worst crisis. And whether it survives, whether it grows more just or less, is not a question of history. It's a choice that every generation, including yours, has to make all over again. If you found this deep dive valuable, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps these long, carefully researched stories reach more people and keep getting made. And if you have your own family stories about what old age looked like before Social Security or thoughts about where it's headed next, drop them in the comments. I read everyone. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.